Oh my, this can't be good for my mental health. But this subject was a Patreon stretch goal, and the numbers say you like the sad videos, so let's talk about one of the darkest events of the 20th century. And that's a lot, because have you seen the 20th century? I know this feels like a glib way to start a serious video, and it's because I'm working myself up to a pretty damn dark subject, and this is about all the levity you're going to get. I guess all this to say, this is a massive content warning. If the title didn't give it away, we're going to some dark places, and if you're feeling vulnerable or have children watching with you, you might want to give this one a pass. It's been 24 years since a horrific genocide occurred in the African nation of Rwanda. Estimates vary, but over a 100-day period between 500,000 and 2 million people were massacred. I want that to really sink in. Even by conservative estimates, that's a reasonably sized city murdered. Those who committed this genocide targeted an ethnic minority in the country known as the Tutsi people, and belonged to the Hutu majority. The genocide itself killed as many as 70% of the Tutsi people, as well as about 30% of the Pygmy Batwa people. And you'd think the world would have intervened in such a situation, but it only ended once a Tutsi-backed paramilitary group took over the government. How do these people get there? The story of the Rwandan genocide takes us all the way back to the 19th century, and Rwanda still lives with the scars of these 100 days today. Let's explore what happened, what caused it, and maybe, just maybe, come to an idea of how to never let something like this happen again. Let's start at the beginning of the division between these groups. It's a bit older than colonization, but this is when it began in earnest. Rwanda and neighboring Burundi fell to the hands of the Germans after the Berlin Conference of 1884. When it came to colonial administration, the division sprung up right away. The colonists preferred working with the Tutsis over the Hutu because they believed them to be racially superior. This continued after the Belgians conquered Rwanda during the First World War. The Belgians even used pseudoscience like phrenology to determine why they benefited one group over another. Racists, they're always measuring bones. Later in 1935, the Belgians also implemented ID cards which labeled everyone in the country either as Tutsi, Hutu, Twa, or naturalized. Because European race science makes these categories irreducible, this had a massive effect on the Rwandan society. Before, a wealthy Hutu might become an honorary Tutsi, but now, with strict racial categories and friggin' ID cards, this became a rigid caste system. If you want to learn more about the concept of race to quote-unquote science, you can watch this video here. A Hutu emancipation movement began to grow after the Second World War. Their power base grew from increasing resentment towards the social order and support from the Catholic Church. The divisions established by class and colonization turned into a racial category, and violence between these groups increased year on year. Eventually, the Belgian administrations gave the Hutu power to maintain order. Rwanda got independence in 1962. Already we saw what are referred to as Tutsi purges. Those who left became refugees, primarily in countries like Burundi, Tanzania, Uganda, and Zaire, which is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. In Rwanda, the government was openly hostile towards any Tutsi who remained, slowing down only a bit in the 1970s. Rwanda also exploded in population as it modernized, becoming one of Africa's most densely populated countries by the late 80s. In an agricultural society, many began to have anxiety over competition for land. In 1990, this tension exploded into a civil war between the Hutu-led government and a militia consisting mainly of Tutsi refugees. The war lasted until 1993, when international pressure put it to an end, with a sort of power-sharing agreement. Many conservative Hutus hated this agreement, seeing it as a concession to the enemy. A Hutu power movement began to take hold, and it portrayed Tutsis as alien non-Christians who wanted to enslave the Hutus and rule with a Tutsi king. With all this tension, a small spark could set off mass violence. That came on April 6th of 1994, when a plane carrying the presidents of both Rwanda and Burundi was shot down, killing everyone and ending the peace process. The killings began the next day. I think, though, if I told the story just like this, you would think this was just some spontaneous breakout of violence, another example of the horrors of human nature. I want to point out that this genocide was a plan, looking for an excuse to go into action. Many members of the political elite in Rwanda were planning this genocide. Soldiers, police officers, and government-backed militia members murdered key Tutsi leaders, as well as moderate Hutus who might take power after the death of the president and end the plan prematurely. They set up checkpoints and looked over those ID cards to identify and massacre any Tutsis they could find. These murderers brought in machetes, clubs, and other weapons to encourage regular people to kill, maim, and rape their neighbors and feel free to take their property. Over the next 3 months, between 500,000 and 2 million people were slaughtered. At the same time, that Tutsi militia, called the Rwandan Patriotic Front, renewed its offensive, reigniting the civil war. In this carnage, I think we should talk specifically about two things which made the massacre even worse. First, the church. Many of the Tutsis fleeing the genocide took refuge in churches. However, as I mentioned earlier, the Catholic churches in Rwanda leaned heavier on supporting the Hutus. So many turned overcrowded churches filled with hundreds or thousands of fleeing people over to their butchers. There's a YouTube video of a journalist visiting one of these churches more than 20 years later and goes through the horrors which occurred in these places. I will link it in the cards and description, but yeah, not something to watch as a pick-me-up. The other thing we need to talk about is the radio. During the genocide, radio stations blasted the airwaves with messages targeting specific Tutsis and justified the genocide. They tried to frame it as a slave rebellion and dehumanize the Tutsis, calling them cockroaches. They roused to anger and tried to encourage the Hutus to murder their Tutsi neighbors. And what do you know? Giving a platform to hate speech had a measured effect. A study published in 2014 found that these broadcasts had a significant impact on participation in these mass killings. The broadcasts motivated about 51,000 perpetrators, in total representing approximately 10% of the overall violence. It not only influenced those with radio reception, but spread it to their neighboring villages. The spillover shows evidence it caused more destruction than those directly inspired by the radio broadcasts. Exposure and social interactions brought about by mass media can have a considerable role in participation in violence. Something to remember when someone complains universities don't platform Nazis. What also comes out as a glaring tragedy of the Rwandan genocide is the international community, by and large, did nothing. The United Nations Security Council in 1994 pulled peacekeepers out of Rwanda the month the killing began. Eventually, the UN voted to send in 5,000 peacekeeper troops, but by the time they got there, the genocide was over. In 2014, a Canadian Lieutenant General Roméo Dallaire, who headed the UN peacekeeping operation in Rwanda, claimed the genocide could have been prevented if the UN hadn't pulled out of the region. The French attempted intervention in June of that year, which likely saved a lot of Tutsi lives, but recent reports showed they also helped some of the genocide's plotters to escape, as the Rwandan government in power was a French ally. The genocide officially ended when the RPF took over Rwanda in July, 3 months after the beginning of the killing. The use of rape as a weapon of war caused a spike in HIV infections. Many homes were now run by orphan children or by widows. The genocide also led to a massive depopulation of Rwanda. It caused a massive economic downturn. The new Tutsi-led government prompted many Hutus to leave the country. They were the bulk of an estimated 2 million people who fled Rwanda after the genocide. This new government, claiming a need to stop further genocides, also invaded Zaire in 1996 and 1998, known as the First and Second Congo Wars. A proxy war between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo continues to smolder. Today, Tutsis live in Rwanda, often close to those who perpetrated the killing or their families. There have been some remarkable breakthroughs in reconciliation, but there's still a lot of mistrust and anxiety. How do these groups of people come to terms with what happened and constructively face this atrocity? There have been some attempts to bring in some form of justice for this crime against humanity. In October of 1994, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda was established as an extension for a similar body for former Yugoslavia. Some high-ranking people were tried for their roles in the Rwandan genocide, but in the chaos, many of them have escaped justice. The trials themselves lasted more than 15 years. More recently, in 2008, 3 Rwandan defense officials were convicted of organizing the genocide. But how do we find an answer at the level of streets? How does one move forward from this? Rwanda has tried to go through a process of apologies, atonement, and trying to look towards a brighter future. Rwanda today is a different place than in 1994, but deep scars still remain. What can we take away from this horror as a lesson to make sure something like this never occurs again? Today, the fires of rampant hate speech, dehumanization, and us versus them thinking are rekindling around the world. Maybe if we looked just a little closer at what this leads to, we wouldn't be so eager to move down this path once again. I want to let you know that the meetup I did with Thought Slime and Mexi back in May went so well, we're going to do it again. The meetup is going to happen on September 8th at 7 p.m. at the bar Disgraceland on Bloor Street in Toronto. I look forward to seeing a lot of you out there. If this is your first time here, I make all sorts of history videos about the past. If you want to subscribe now, you'll get more history every week. There's a big backlog for you to check out too. I want to thank 12 Tone for the Step Back theme song, as well as a special thanks for all the fantastic patrons who made this video possible. I especially want to thank John and Carrie Johnson, Kobide Mani, Garrett Kwan, Michael Kirshner, Scott Smith, and James McNeese. Come back next time for more Step Back.